Yo, what's up? Welcome back to another quick Flutter tutorial. In this one, I'm going to show you how we can code an expense tracker using Flutter. So we can add a new expense by giving it a name and the price, and then it will be reflected in a nice bar graph as a weekly summary at the top. And of course, you can also slide each expense to delete them, and everything will adjust accordingly. So let me show you how to do this by jumping into the code. So I've opened up a brand new Flutter project, and just to keep everyone on the same page, in my main function, I'm running my app, which brings us to this home page. And I've got that in a separate folder called pages to keep it organized. And this is just a blank scaffold, so you should just have a blank white app like this. Now the first thing is I'm going to create another folder called models, and let's create our expense item. So we want to represent each expense using a few different parameters. So the first thing is the name, the amount for the expense, and also the date for it. So let's create the constructors for these. Cool. And then I'm going to create another folder called data, and let's call this expense data.dart. And for this one, this will handle all the data related parts for our expenses. So let's create a bit of a plan here. So I'm just going to comment here. So the first thing I want is a list of all of the expenses. And then let's create a method to get the expense list when we ask for it. And the two main functions we need is an ability to add a new expense and also delete an expense. And a couple more methods that will be handy for us later on is going to be a method to get the weekday, so like Monday, Tuesday, etc., from a particular datetime object. And for displaying the expenses in a nice graph later, I want to just display the current week, so from Sunday through to Saturday. So I also want a method here to get the date for the start of the week. Cool. And the last thing is, like I said, I want to display this in a nice bar graph. So we're going to convert our big list of expenses into a nice little expense summary. So what I mean is, for example, our list from the very beginning is going to look something like this. So we created an expense item earlier, right? So we're going to have a bunch of expense items in this list. And each expense is going to have a name, a date, and the amount, right? So as an example, this will be what our expense list is going to look like. And I want to convert this into another list. Let's call it daily expense summary. And what I want for this list is, if you look at it carefully, our overall expense list is going to have multiple dates. Like on the 30th, there was multiple transactions. And I just want to gather that into the total amount for that particular day. So I just want a summary for each day and how much we spent for each day. Okay, cool. So let's start coding this out. The first thing is just a list of expense items. And let's also create a method just to get the expense list when we call it. And this is the main part here. So adding a new expense. Let's call it add new expense, and let's make sure that we give it the expense item so that we know what we're going to store. And to do that, we're just going to add it to our overall list. Cool. And deleting the expense as well. So this one, we also want to know which expense we're looking at, and we just need to remove it from the list. Okay, now for the next method, so I'm just going to give it the type of a string. So get day name. So with a particular daytime, I'm just going to use a switch statement here. So you can see for the daytime object, we can check the weekday, but it tells you the weekday in terms of a number, like 7 represents Sunday. So I'm just going to convert this and say, okay, if the number is 1, then that's Monday. And let's just go through all the weeks so that we can return the name of the day. And for the default case, let's just return nothing. Cool. Now the next thing is I want to display it from the start of the week, so Sunday. So we can first of all just get today's date. And we're just going to go backwards from today to find the nearest Sunday. Okay, so now we can use our get day name, which is handy. And we're going to go from today and let's subtract the number of days. So we're going to do a quick for loop. So obviously at the beginning, I is going to be 0 and it's going to increment in the next for loop. I is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 until we find Sunday. And so once we've found that Sunday, let's store that in our start of week variable and then we can just return it. Awesome. And now for the last method here. So this one is, like I said before, it has all the individual transactions, which has multiple transactions for a given date. So I just want to combine this together for a nice total representing each day, right? So I'm going to represent this using a map. So as an example, for the date, I want to store it as a string and I'm going to say the year, month, and the day and the amount total for that day. Cool. Now, just before we finish this method off, I'm going to create another folder called datetime. And in my previous few tutorials, like the workout tutorial and habit tracker, stuff like that, I created a method to help us to get the date in a more kind of easier way to store it. So what I mean is I want to convert a datetime object to a string that is just the year, month, and day. So I'll show you how to do this. So with a given datetime object, I want to get the year in the format of YYYY, right? Like 2023. And for the month, same thing, just the month, MM. And lastly, the day, DD. And then we can combine this all together. Cool, now one little adjustment we need to make is sometimes the month, like February, could give us just the number 2, but I want it to be 02, just to be consistent in the format. So if the length of the month is just 1, like it's a single digit number, then let's append a 0 in front of it. Okay, same thing for the day. If it's just a single digit day, like 3, I want it to say 03. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to put it in this format is a datetime object tells you the year, the month, the day, but it also tells you like the hour, the minute, and the seconds, which we don't really need the ending part of it. So I just want to get rid of the end and also just convert it, just the year, month, and day in a nice format. Cool. And as I mentioned before, sometimes if you have a single digit number, I just want to add a 0. So it's like 02, just to be consistent. Cool. So if we come back to our expense data, so we're going to store it just without these slashes, just the year, month, and day. Cool. So let's do a quick for loop and go through each expense. And now we can use that method to convert the datetime object to a string that we just did. And so let's give it the datetime of the expense. And for the amount, so I'm going to use a double so that I can actually calculate these values. So let's convert the expense amount, which is a string, to a double. And let's just check here, right? So in the daily expense summary, if it already has this date, like if the date already exists, then instead of just creating another date, just add it on. Okay, so let's get the current amount if it's already there. And just add on this new amount. Cool, and we can give the new amount to that particular date. So this way we can just add up all of the same days and add the $10, 15 becomes $25 for that day. Else, if it isn't already in there, like if this is a new date, then that's easy. We can just add the date and the amount. Cool. And then we can return our daily expense summary. So this one is going to be really helpful for us when we display our expenses in a weekly bar graph. Yay, so now we can start working on the UI. So let's come back to the homepage scaffold, and I'm just going to create a floating action button to add a new expense. Sweet, there it is. So if I click on this plus button, then I want to show a dialog. And let's just give it a title for now. And let's see if this works. So if I save it and I click on this button, sweet, so there's our little box. Now I need to have a column of text fields. So I need to get the user's input for the name and the amount. So if I just put in a couple text fields and I save this, let's see what it looks like. So you can see the user can start typing in these text field boxes. Now one thing to adjust is because of the column, it makes the box really tall. So one thing you can do is you can change this main axis size to be the min. Sweet. So when the user types something in the text field, for us to get access to what they typed in, we have to use a controller. So I'm going to create two controllers here. So one for the expense name and the other one for the expense amount. And so if you look in the text field, you can see we can give it the controller now. And then below that, we have to create some buttons, right? So in the actions, let's create a save button and a cancel button. Cool, and let's just create the two methods below it. Sweet, so we can type stuff in and then, looks like it's the same. Oh, the controller. Yep, the first one should have been the name controller. Cool, so once they type it in and I click save, we want to go to this save method and add it to our expense data, right? So to do this, for a bit of state management, I'm going to use provider. So if you go to your pubspec.yaml, import this provider package. And so just a little bit of setting up to do. If you come back to the main.dart file, let's wrap our material app in a change notifier provider. And for the create, we can now give it the expense data that we made before. And coming back to the expense data class, we can now extend the change notifier. So what we just did is we can come back to our save method and we can use this provider. So let's just make sure to import this. And you can see now we have access to all of those methods that we had before. So I want to add a new expense and we have to give it the expense, right? So let's create this expense item. Which requires us to give it a name, amount, and the date time. So for the name, that's just in the name controller. For the amount, that's the amount controller. And for the date time, that's just going to be now. So today. Cool, and then we can now give this new expense and add it. Sweet, so now that we've added a new expense, let's just make sure to display it back in a list. So if I create a list view builder here, let's display in a list tile. And so to get access to our expense data, we're going to wrap this entire scaffold in a consumer so that we can consume the data. Okay, and if you check out this value, this has all of the information that we need. So in the title of the list tile, let's go value and then get all of the expense lists and then go through each index and get the name. Now it looks like we have a bit of an error because we didn't actually specify the item count. So for the item count, it's just going to be however many we have in that list. Okay, so let's see if this works. So if I say food 20 and I save it, looks like nothing's really happening, and that's because if I come back to my expense data, we have to make sure if we made any changes, we have to notify the listeners. Cool, so let's try this again. So food, and it's 20, then you can see it gets added on into the list. Now you can already see the first thing we've got to change is I want to pop this dialog after we hit save. So at the end of the save method as well as the cancel method, let's just pop the dialog. So if I try this again, we can see the dialog goes away. Cool. Now one other issue is if you open up the plus button again, our information is still there from the previous user's input. So we want to clear this, right? So I'm going to create a quick method down here called clear the controllers and do that as well at the end of the save method and the cancel method. So if I type something in and I reopen this, then it should no longer be there. Okay, sweet. So now we can start building out this UI. So we've got the title. What about the subtitle? I think it's probably a good place to put the date in the subtitle. And for the trailing at the end of it, let's put in the amount. So if I save this, we can see our list tile is looking pretty good so far. And this is what I was explaining earlier about the date time. It tells us the year, the month, the day, but also the hours, minutes, seconds, and all that. So I don't want to display too much of this information. And also for the amount, I want to append a $sign in front of it. So this is a good time to start building our UI components in a separate file. So I'm just going to create a new folder called components, and let's create a expense tile. So let's copy the list tile we had from before and paste it in here. And so we have these three values. So I'm just going to get rid of these for now and pass them through as parameters. So we need the name, we need the amount, and we also need the date. So let's make sure to require these when we create it. And so we can do our little customization here. So for the date time, remember we didn't want to display the full date with the minutes and the seconds and all that. So I just want to display the day first. Let's put a slash and then get the month and then slash and get the year. Sweet, so if I come back to my home page and I create this expense tile, our code looks much cleaner now. We can just give it the three inputs, right? So that's going to be the same thing we did earlier. So value and get the name, the amount, and the date time. So if I save this, it's looking much cleaner. And if you need to make any changes to the way the expense tile looks, you can just do that in this file. Makes our code look much easier. So, which reminds me, we can put our $sign in now. Sweet, this is looking really good. So now that we have the ability to input some transactions or the expenses, let's create a bar graph at the top for the weekly summary. So I'm going to copy this list view builder that we have and put it inside another list view. And at the top, I want the weekly summary bar graph, and then below that, the expenses. So if you save this, we should get some error, and that's because if we have a list inside of another list, we have to do some setting up. So this shrink wrap, we have to set it to be true. And I also don't want this to be scrollable. So if I save this, it should be all good. And for the weekly summary, let's come to our components and create it here. So for the expense summary, we want to have a bar graph. So let's create a new folder called bar graph. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a new file called individual bar. And so let's just create this real quick. So each bar we're going to need an integer for the x, which is the position on the x-axis, and also a double for the y. So that's going to be the amount in terms of dollars. So let's just create the constructors for these. And now I'm going to create another file called bar data. And so with this, we're going to create a bunch of doubles. So the amount for each day. Okay, so we're going to go from Sunday to Saturday. And so once we have the amount for all of the days, let's create a list of individual bars called bar data. And then let's create a method here real quick just to initialize the data into our list. Okay, so in the bar data, like I said, we're going to have individual bars. And the x is just the position on the x-axis. So going from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the y is going to be the amount for each day. Cool, so that's all ready. Now if you come back to your pubspec.yaml, let's bring in a new package called flchart. This is a very famous package that we use in Flutter. Cool, so let's create one last file called myBarGraph. Let's create one last file called bargraph. And if you want more detail on how to use this, then check out the package. I'll definitely link it below, but I can show you how to use this right now. So bar chart is what we need. And we have to give it the bar chart data. So the first thing to fill out is the max y. So the maximum amount, let's just say 100 for now. And the minimum, let's go 0. So 0 to 100 on the y-axis. But let's come up here to the top and I'm going to create a double for the max y so that we can specify this a bit later on. And let's make sure to pass through those double amounts for Sunday all the way through to Saturday. Cool, so at the beginning of this bar graph, when we build it, let's make sure to initialize the bar data. So that's what we had earlier. And then once that's all initialized, we can now have the access to the bar data. So let's give it the max y. And for the bar groups, this is the most important part to fill out. We can now say, okay, my bar data, and we're going to map this information. So we can say for the x, let's give it the data x and convert it to a list. And similarly for the bar rods, we're going to have to give it the data for the y. And we can decorate this up, but let me show you what this looks like before we continue so that we can see the different changes. So coming back to our expense summary file, let's create a parameter here for the start of the week. Right, so we want to display it from Sunday through to Saturday. And so once we know the start of the week, let's consume our expense data. And let's just create a sized box here so we can specify the height. And then let's create the bar graph. So we have to give it these amounts. And so for the max y, let's just fix in 100 for now. We can change this a bit later on. And like I said, just to show you, let's just put some numbers in and see what this looks like. So coming back to the home page, let's finally bring in the expense summary. Cool, so if you just rerun this, sweet, there's our graph and you can see So on the bottom, we have the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's going to be Sunday through to Saturday. And you can see for the max Y as well, is the 100 is the max. So if I change it to 200, then everything will shift accordingly. Cool, so these are just some fixed values that we just hard coded in. Now we want to actually get the information from our expense data, right? So let's get the date for each day of the week. So since we know what the start of the week is, let's just add 0 days for Sunday. And let's go through to Monday, Tuesday, and all the way through to Saturday. And so from the start of the week, which is Sunday, let's just add 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So since we know the dates for each of these now, let's give it the amount to our bar graph. So if we go to the value, let's calculate the daily expense summary, which should be a list. Oh, sorry, it was a map. And let's give it the Sunday date. Now this could be null, by the way, if there was no expenses for that day. So if that's the case, then just put in 0. So let's do that for every day. Cool, and you can see right now we don't have any bar graphs. So let's try this out. If I'm putting a new expense in, say 55 for the food, then you can see we get a new bar graph. And today is Saturday, so yep, that's where it is. Sweet, so now that we have the basic functionality down, you guys know I love to make it look aesthetically pleasing, so let's decorate this up. So for the color, let's change it to a gray color, and you can also control this width. And it's looking pretty round, but I want this border radius to be specifically, say 4. That's looking pretty good. And the backdraw rod data. So first of all, let's set this to be true. And what this one is I basically want to show where the space can fill up to, right? So what I mean is, say for example, if I just make it red so it's more visible, you can see it'll just fill up to the max Y. And so one thing we can do is maybe change this to white, or maybe like a slightly lighter gray. Just coming outside of this in the bar chart, let's go to the grid data. And this I actually want to show false. So I don't want that grid on the back. Same thing for the border, like the square around it, I also don't want to show that. And looking at the titles, so if I just set this to be true, you can see there's titles on all 4 sides. So for the top one, I don't want to show this. And let's just copy this thing because I also don't want to show it for the left. And the right. So obviously if you want, you can customize this to how you want this to look. But I'm just going to go for a bit of a minimal look. And so I only want titles on the bottom and just show the days. So like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, etc. So for this one, I'm going to separate this widget out and let's create it below. So let's just create a bit of a text style here so we can decorate how we want this to look. So I'm going to use a switch statement. And so depending on the value that we have, so that value is referring to 0 through to 6. So if it's 0, then I just want to say Sunday. Now, you could use the word sun, but I'm just going to make it much more minimal and just say S. Okay, we'll just get the first letter of each day. Cool, and just by default, then let's just put nothing. So if I return this, and save it, you can see on the bottom, it's got those nice letters. And I think that looks really good. Now let's keep the colors consistent in our app. So our floating action button, let's change the color to be black. And if you actually click on it, it looks like you can actually see the tooltip, like it shows you what the value is. Now let's just space this out a little bit. Okay, so just a little cleanup that we can do for this app. So far it's looking good, but if you go to the options for the simulator, you can actually show the software keyboard. So you can see for the name of the expense, obviously we just want to type in some letters, but when it comes to the amount, I don't want the user to be able to type in letters. We want just numbers, right? So if you come to the text field for the expense amount, I'm going to copy this text field and create two separate text fields. So one for the dollars and one for the cents. And you don't have to do this exactly the way I do it, but I'm just going to separate it into the dollars and cents text field, just so that I don't have to deal with the decimal. Because if we allow a decimal, then the user can type multiple decimals and there's a lot of things to check there. So I'm just going to separate this out. And then when we save it, let's put the two texts together. And just put a decimal in between. So I think this is just the easiest way to go about this. And if you save this, it looks like we have an error because if you have a text field in a row, we have to specify the width. So one easy way to do this is I'm just going to wrap both of these guys in a expanded widget just to fill up the rest of the space. Sweet. Which reminds me, actually, we should put some hint text here just to make it nicer for the user to know what they should type in. Yeah, like that. Cool. So now that we have it separated out, just going back to that problem of only wanting the user to input numbers, if you go to the text field, you can see the keyboard type and just go number. So if I save this again, yeah, you can see we have the number pad for that section. Sweet. Okay, sweet. So now what we need to do is everything is working functionally, but if I restart this app, it will not have any memory, right? It's like a brand new app every time we start it. So now let's try to store this data in our local database. And my favorite local database is Hive. So let's make sure to add that in your pubspec.yaml. And I've made many tutorials using Hive, so I'll link those below, but I can show you how to use it here real quick. So a couple bit of setting up to do. The first thing is in your main function, we have to change this to be an asynchronous function. And we have to initialize Hive and also open a Hive box. Now for the box, this is going to be the name of your database. So I'm just going to call it expense database. If you come to the data folder, let's create a new file called Hive database. Again, before we code, let's have a bit of a plan and an outline of what we need to fill out. So the first thing always for a Hive database is to reference our box that we opened in the main function. And then the two main things here is just writing data and then reading data. Cool, so let's fill this out. So I'm gonna create a final called my box. And what did we call it again? Expense database. Cool, now when it comes to saving the data, when we call this function from our app, let's give it the list of expenses, right? And we're just going to store that list in our in our database. Now, one thing to note is in Hive, you can only store like the basic primitive types, meaning like strings, integers, datetime, stuff like that, and not custom objects. So we created this custom object expense item. Now Hive does have the capability to store these kind of custom objects, but using type adapters and stuff like that. And so you can look at the Hive documentation to do that, but it requires a little bit more setting up. And since our expense item basically just has those primitive types, I'm just going to do a little bit of our own setting up just so that we can save it into Hive. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert the expense item objects into a list of types that we can store in Hive. So for example, if you look at the all expense list that we are given, it will be a list of expense items, right? So the expense item has a name, the amount, and a date time, and some other expense items. And so in each expense item, let's just grab those three parameters. So the name, amount, and the date time. Okay, I want to convert this into a list of another list, which just has those three values. Okay, so we're going to convert from this custom object into just a list of basic data types. So we're going to have a list of another list that is dynamic. Dynamic meaning you have like strings as well as date times in there. And let's call this list all expenses formatted. Sweet, so let's do a quick for loop and go through each expense. And let's convert it into a list of storable types. So let's get the expense name, the expense amount, and the date time. Cool, and then once we've done that, let's just add that to our overall list of expenses. And once that's all converted, finally we can store it in our database. So we can use the put, and for the key, I'm going to say just all expenses. And let's put our list in there. Cool, and that's it. If you have any questions about what we just did, I'm happy to help you out. So just try to ask a question or comment below. And then now we can read the data. So this one, we're going to do something similar as to what we just did. So in our Hive, all of the data is stored as a list of strings and date times like we just did. So now let's convert those information into creating an expense item so that we can display it back into our app. Okay, so this will just kind of be the reverse of it. So in our saved data, we'll have like the name, the amount, and the date time, and let's just convert this and create the expense item. So to read the data, we have to say my box and then use the word get. Now, if no information has been saved in there, we could get a null. So if it's null, then let's just return an empty list. Cool, and let's just do our quick for loop again. And let's collect the individual expense data. So this I is for a particular list. And then 0, 1, 2 is the values inside of that list. And so now we can finally create the expense item. Cool, so that's done. Sweet, so now that our Hive database is all set up, let's come back to the expense data.dart file and let's prepare the data to display. So when the user first starts this app, we want to just check if there already exists data, then let's get that data. So to do this, we actually will need to get a database object. So we can create that right now. I'm just going to call it db. And then we can say db.readData. Now this should return a list of expense items. And so I'm just going to do a quick check. If it's not empty, meaning there's something already in there, then let's return that list to our overall expense list. And otherwise it'll just remain blank. So when you come back to your home page, in our initial state, when the app first fires up, let's just make sure to prepare the data. Sweet, so now let's try to add a new expense. And it looks like I restarted it and the data didn't get saved. So, oh, I know why. That's because when you come back to the expense data, we didn't actually call the save method. So let's think about when we want to save it in our database. So anytime that we add a new expense, let's save the data. And also if we delete the expense, let's also save the data. So let's try this again. Cool, there it is. And if I restart it, cool, the data persists. So it's successfully stored on your local device. So even if I kill the app and I restart it, it should remain there. Yay! Now just a few more things to think about is if we keep adding the expense, the bar is going to fill up, right? So I think we made the cap to be 100. So if you go above the cap, then the bar is going to be too high, right? So instead of hard coding this 100 for the max, let's do a little method here to sort of readjust the max amount so everything fits nicely and it's relative. So let's calculate the max, and what I'm going to do is essentially get the highest value for all of the days. So let's store it in a list of doubles. And then let's sort it from the smallest to the largest. And so the largest amount should be at the end. And so let's get that number and let's just increase that slightly so that it almost looks full. Okay, I'm just going to times it by 1.1. And we're just going to do a quick check here as well, because if it's 0, then let's make the default 100. And then otherwise, let's give it the new cap. So basically what we did is it'll never be quite full. And this is important because we need to readjust this max because you don't want to put a hard-coded number in there. So all of the other days is going to be relative to the highest amount. So again, let me know if that doesn't make any sense, but this is very important to have in this kind of app. Sweet, speaking of which, we should also have a kind of summary at the top to add up the weekly expense, right? So we have it for each day right now. So let's just add it together. So let's wrap this in a column. And at the top, we want the week's total. There it is. Let's just put some padding. So something like this, right? Week total is like $200. Let's make the first text bold. And so this $200 is what we have to calculate now, the week total. So let's create another method. And let's do something similar. And this time, we just need to add up all of these values together, right? So let's do a quick for loop. And add all of these values together. And let's return it as a string with 2 decimal places. Cool, so now we can return this. And you can see that it adds up all of the expenses for the week. So it should adjust accordingly, and that's looking pretty good. Okay, awesome. Now the very last thing I just want to show here is just the ability to delete the expense. So we already made this method at the very start of the video, so you should be able to see that delete expense. Now, one way to delete it is I like to use this package called Slidable, which again, I've used in my previous apps. And this one makes it look pretty good. So I'll show you how to do it again. So go to your expense tile, and we're going to wrap this in a slidable widget. And I want to show the button from the end. Okay, there's a lot of different motions you can choose. I'm just going to choose this stretch motion. And we can have a couple buttons. So let's say delete button. And let's make sure to pass this method at the top. And we can specify an icon as well. So let's just see what this looks like. If you come back to the expense tile, let's pass through this method. And the expense that we're going to delete is this one, this particular index. And we can slide it, and there it is. There's our delete button. Now we can come back to the slidable and just finish up the decoration. So I feel like a red color is pretty suitable for this. And the corners are looking very sharp. So let's just curve that as well. And by the way, if you want, you can actually add more buttons here, maybe like an edit button. So for this one, I'm just going to have just a delete button for now. Okay, and the very last bug fix we need to account for is if you create a new expense and you don't fill out any of these fields and you save it, you're going to get some error because, yeah, there's nothing in there. So right now we saved in a invalid double. So I'm actually going to come back to the main.dat file and just change the database name. So we just get a clean database. And the check we need to do is in your save method, let's only save it under a condition. So only save expense if all fields are filled. So if you look at the 3 text controllers that we had, just make sure that it's not empty. Okay, so only if all of them are filled are we going to save the data. Okay, so if I save this and try again, you shouldn't get any more errors. So even if I save it, nothing will happen. And that's it. So that's all I had planned for this particular video. So obviously with apps like these, you can kind of keep going on and customize it further and add more functionality, which I may do as well because I probably want to use this expense tracker for myself. But looks like we're already at almost an hour for this tutorial. So if you guys have any questions, leave a comment below. And if you made it this far into the tutorial, great job, pat on the back, and leave me a purple heart below if you made it this far, just so I know. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!